Exploring the Analects, Episode 17, Passage 6.25. Don't call a tail a leg. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 17 of Exploring the Analects. In this episode, we'll be covering Passage 6.25 of the Analects, a 7-character phrase about the power of names. First, I'll read the passage in Chinese and English. Then I'll discuss the historical and cultural context behind the phrase to provide a deeper understanding. After that, we'll analyze the language found in the passage as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and in modern Mandarin. If you're a visual learner, you'll definitely want to check out my new YouTube channel, where I'm publishing videos that feature many of the Chinese terms discussed in this episode. The videos are also packed full of images of classical Chinese paintings, artifacts, and more for you to enjoy. And as always, you can also follow along with the episode guide on analects.net, where you'll find all the Chinese terms in this episode, as well as a newly revamped full text of the Analects. If you have any questions, give me a shout anytime at elliot@analects.net. All right then, let's get the juices flowing with the story about Abraham Lincoln. It's said that he once told the following joke to an audience. If you call a dog's leg a tail, how many legs does the dog have? Here's the punchline. 4. Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. His point was that you can't change the nature of something just by changing its name. But as we'll see in this episode, Confucius was worried that the more you call a tail a leg, the harder it becomes for people to recognize the value of a real leg. Now I'm going to read passage 6.25 in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, followed by a translation into English. 子曰：孤不孤，孤哉，孤哉。 A goo that's not a goo. What a goo. What a goo. Some passages in the Analects say what they mean and mean what they say. You can elaborate by talking about the political turmoil of the spring and autumn period, or what the pitfalls of certain approaches to life are. But they're just as easy to understand today as they were 2,500 years ago. Here's the core of passage 15.24, just as an example. Do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire. You get it, right? This is the Confucian version of the Golden Rule. Passages like that aren't why I started this podcast. I started it for passages like 6.25. Imagine you cracked open the book. You found yourself on passage 6.25 and read, a goo that's not a goo. You might ask yourself, did Confucius inspire Lewis Carroll? Is it even worth reading the next passage, which, by the way, is another head-scratcher about being stuck in a well? I had enough false starts with passages like these, and so here I am, trying to make sure that no matter where you jump in, there's something you can hang your hat on. Or maybe more appropriately, you don't smack right into the bottom of an empty vessel. Here's another thing. Maybe you've been to the Forbidden City or the Met and wandered past row after row of antique pottery and bronzeware. If you've been in that scenario, what did you think? I mean, it's unlikely you had a checklist and were super psyched to find at least 20 zuns, all 8 goos, and 5 dings. It's been pretty mind-numbing for me, too. Even when I stood there and read the intros, I'd still be in this sea of oddly specific vessel shapes that really I was sure had some meaning, but what meaning exactly would be anyone's guess. I felt the same way when I went to Rome. I understand some of the symbolism of the religious art, but the themes I do understand got a little repetitive, and there was just so much more I knew was obviously going right over my head. So here we are at this very opaque statement about a very specific ritual vessel. If I do the job right, you won't just stand a bit of a chance of recognizing this one next time you're at the museum. You'll also know what it was used for, why it had its oddly specific shape, and why Confucius chose it as the focus of this passage. But more importantly than all of those things, you'll understand what he was complaining about, because as much as he cared about ritual vessels, and I guarantee you he cared a whole lot, he cared even more about calling things by the names that they deserve. Let's take a step back first, though, and talk about the power of the vessel as a metaphor. While I was preparing this episode, I randomly came across an article on the history of the container as a technology in New Scientist magazine. The article is entitled, "The Story of the First Human Tool, the Humble Container." Well, according to this article, humans have been using containers for at least 100,000 years, and there's possible evidence of container usage up to 500,000 years ago. That would make slings and baskets just as ancient as chipped stone tools. We also know that the Shang-era civilization of China was already making elaborate bronze vessels 1,000 years before the time of Confucius. I'm pointing this out all just to say that, like most things, you start out with something functional like an unadorned tray or a rough-hewn earthen cup, but as time goes on, forms are refined, ornament is added, and then ritual and symbolism develop. The same thing happened with other tools and weapons. Rocks turned into arrows and spearheads, and eventually you've got ceremonial blades made out of ivory and jade. These things aren't for everyday use. They're markers of values, social classes, cosmological beliefs, and all of that. The gu is just like that. Like a lot of ritual vessels, it's for drinking wine, but it's for drinking a very specific amount of wine and in a very specific fashion. That is, slowly. So first, here's a bit of info on the dimensions of the gu. According to a Ming Dynasty source, it should be 1 foot tall with a mouth diameter of 5 inches and a base diameter of 3 inches. It should have a capacity of 2 sheng, or roughly 2 to 3 glasses of wine. I'm going to include a photo of a gu on the episode guide, so check it out to get a clearer picture. But here are a few more details about its shape. This is a tall vessel that's slender in the center and flared both at the base and at the top. The top usually looks something like the bell of a trumpet. The bottom should always be narrower than the top, and during Confucius's time, the base was most commonly square. One traditional commentary from the uniquely named Den Tian Lu, or Records of Cinnabar and Lead, states, "The ancients valued symbolism when crafting vessels. Taking the gu as an example, its round top symbolized heaven, and its square bottom symbolized earth, which also made it stable when set down." How practical. You might be hearing this and thinking, drinking out of that thing would actually be kind of like trying to drink out of a box or off of a plate. Well, no matter the shape of your gu, drinking out of it isn't going to be very easy. And that was the point. When you were sitting with friends and enjoying some wine, or if you were in the middle of a solemn ceremony, the gu would be telling you to slow down and to drink less. Each sip must be taken carefully and deliberately. The form of the gu was critical here. It wasn't random, and it wasn't a generic vessel, whatever we'd call like a mug or a glass. That highly specific shape was what made the gu a gu. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. Imagine you're a big gu guy, and you know a great gu when you see one. Just like everyone else in your city, you go do ancestral worship, various other festivals and rituals on a seasonal basis. A lot of them are community events where people sing and dance and drink together. Some of these events are attended by very important people. You know, governors, heads of powerful families, and so on. They'll get up in front of the crowd and make speeches or lead rituals. So how they act is really front and center for everyone else in the community to see. Being a gu guy, you're pretty in tune with when they're supposed to be using a gu and how they're supposed to be using it. And what you've noticed is the people leading these ceremonies are using some very unusual gus. Not only do they flare less than they're supposed to, their capacity is all wrong. Sometimes it's a 1 shang gu, other times it's 3. They get up there and they do oaths like, "Oh, this gu I proffer to the spirits, giving thanks for the bounties of this season." Then they just down the whole thing in one gulp. What a gu! Well, of course we don't know exactly what Confucius had in mind here. Maybe the gu he had in mind was supposed to have the square rim, but he couldn't find any like that at the local shop. Maybe they were supposed to be decorated with ram's head designs or boar tusk designs. It actually doesn't matter all that much. What we know is that people were using something and calling it a gu, but the vessel no longer had the power to remind those drinking of the virtues of care and deliberate action. And by complaining about a gu that's not a gu, Confucius was saying that misnaming something takes power away from the original bearer of that name. So Confucius used his platform, like we talked about in episode 1. He urged his students to zhongming, or rectify names. In other words, if something superior is now being referred to by a dishonorable name, or if something inferior is now being referred to by an honorable name, take a stand and correct that inaccuracy. Not doing so leads to confusion at best, if not actual chaos. The classical commentary I mentioned earlier, the Records of Cinnabar and Lead, continues on this point by saying, though the matter was small, casually altering ancient institutions was already the beginning of a slippery slope that would lead later generations to abolish the pathways between fields, destroy the well-field system, burn the odes and documents, and revere strict penal laws. That's all a reference to what happened at the end of the Zhou dynasty, when Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, attempted to erase ancient cultural and government institutions while enacting a draconian set of legal reforms. Back to the point about rectification of names. Why should a vessel be called a gu if it had anything other than a tusheng capacity? Why should it be called a gu if it didn't have a properly flared mouth? Call that thing something else, and call a gu a gu. This idea appears throughout the Analects. Perhaps most famously, it appears in passage 12.11, where Confucius told the Duke of Qi, "Let a ruler be a ruler, a minister be a minister, a father be a father, and a son be a son." These roles are just like the gu. They're archetypes for a reason. We expect rulers to have dignity and a deep sense of humanity. We expect them to have clarity about right and wrong, and we expect them to be firm and give orders. Confucius wanted us to remember that those are expectations for a very important reason. If a ruler doesn't have those qualities, not only will they not succeed as a ruler, they'll do great damage to all those around them. Idealizing other qualities as those a ruler should have leads to peril, Confucius would say. Imagine if everyone began to believe a ruler should be someone with great wealth, or people started to accept that a ruler could be profane and vindictive. What could possibly go wrong? Maybe you don't need to imagine too hard. All right, now that we've got a handle on the meaning of passage 6.25, let's check out the language. As always, my goal here is to provide some points for everyone, from early stage language learners all the way through to those looking for advanced vocabulary and classical Chinese constructs. This time, I'm afraid there's not going to be a whole lot on the early side, but I'll do what I can. There's going to be some repetition from previous episodes. Starting off with 子曰, possibly the most commonly repeated characters in the Analects. 子 refers to Confucius and is short for Kongzi, or Master Kong. Yue is a pictograph of a mouth with the tongue visible. In other words, speech. So these two characters are nearly always translated as the master said. One note about the name Confucius. You may be aware that Confucius is Kongzi's Latinized name. We don't know exactly who among the Jesuits came up with it, but Michel Ruggieri and Matteo Ricci began to popularize the name in the late 16th century. A similar kind of Latinization occurred with that other Confucian great, Mengzi, whose name was rendered as Mencius. I'm not sure why they didn't go with Shunxius for Shunzi, or Laotius for Laozi, or Hanfeius for Hanfeizi, but those guys never got the honor. Anyone ever hear of the great philosopher Buti Lizi? It's late. For beginners, the only other character you'll be sure to want to know is the negative bu. There are quite a few negative markers throughout the Analects. Some will serve you well in modern Chinese as well, such as fei, and of course, the most generally applicable one we see right here, bu. If you're wanting to dip your toes into classical Chinese, this isn't a bad passage to start with. So let's hop right in with gu bu gu. Just like in modern Mandarin, articles are often excluded. So you just have to assume the most general case. When you see gu at the beginning of this sentence, you have to read it as a gu, since there's no indication of a specific gu that's under discussion. Now that we know the subject or topic of our sentence, we'll naturally expect a comment about it to follow. The comment is bu gu. So this general gu under discussion, we're talking about one that's not a gu. This is an ungooey gu. Last up, you have this repeated gu zai, gu zai. All you need to know about zai is that it adds a rhetorical and lamenting tone to the passage. So Confucius is sighing, saying, "Holy cow, you're calling that thing a gu." Last up, just a few fun notes from commentaries that didn't really fit anywhere else into the episode. It's really ironic that this whole episode is about things going by the wrong names. Some commentators actually didn't even know whether Confucius was talking about a ritual vessel or something else completely. By the Qin and Han dynasties, there were small faceted slips of wood used for writing that were also called gu, and some commentators thought that he was referring to those. The Yan Tie Lun, the discourses on salt and iron, tries to make sense of Confucius' apparent comment on some pieces of wood with writing on them. I suppose suggesting that writing carefully on them is what makes them important. The book said, "If human effort is applied, it becomes an implement for use in the ancestral temple. Otherwise, it's just firewood for cooks and menials." There's also a phrase found in the Shi Ji, the records of the grand historian, "Po gu wei yuan," or breaking the gu to make it round. This phrase was used to describe how the Han dynasty discarded many of the more extreme and inhumane policies of the Qin. This is even more ironic than the wooden slips. Confucius used changes in the gu to point out the dangers of disregarding the intent behind traditions. Then, Sima Qian used changes in the gu as a metaphor for returning to a more humane set of traditional practices after a period of radical departure from them. All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out the episode guide on analects.net for a picture of a gu in all its glory, plus just about every Chinese character I've mentioned in this episode. And again, if you're the visual learner type, I highly recommend you subscribe to my new YouTube channel. Join me next time for a discussion of Passage 7.13, a list of 3 things that worried Confucius the most. See you there.